There is no good way to find out that your wife has had sex with another man. But trust me, some are worse than others. But of course, the way I found out has to be the worst of them all. This day was similar to many others that had preceded it, and the weather, if anything, from what I remembered of it, was nothing exceptional. What was abnormal was that when I got home that evening, my wife, with whom I had lived for 6 years, was not there. Robin was working part-time at an insurance office for some guy named Tom Blowers, had been there for about 6 months, and was usually home by then. I was away on business for a few days, and was looking forward to being welcomed back into the arms of my beautiful young wife. Her not being there didn't particularly bother me, but unfortunately, my lack of concern was about to spill out. An hour later, and I was beginning to worry when the front doorbell rang. I jumped up and headed for the door, wondering if Robin had lost her key, but when I opened the door, I was surprised to find 2 policemen there. "Mr. John Fielding?" he asked calmly. "It's me," I replied, wondering what they could possibly want. "Is your wife Robin Fielding?" "That's right," I confirmed, my insides filling with lead as I imagined what bad news that question might mean. It was, much worse than I could ever have expected. "We're very sorry, sir, but we have some bad news for you. The rest of it was like a blur, and you'll have to excuse me if I don't, or rather can't repeat it word for word. The bad news, of course, was that my Robin, my beautiful young wife, was no longer with us. She wasn't at home with my cooked dinner on the table for the simple reason that some poor, unfortunate soul was pulling her lifeless body out of the river. She wouldn't be there with my dinner ready the next day or the day after tomorrow. I cried a lot over the next few days. I cried and cried out to a God I never believed in to ask how he could be so cruel. I opened her drawers and closets and spent hours looking at her clothes and underwear, unable to accept that I would never see any of it on my beautiful wife again. People were nice, or trying to be nice, but how could they comfort the inconsolable? I hardly knew her parents, who lived overseas, but even so, calling them with the news was just awful. Could none of them bring my Robin back? Just when I thought I had reached the bottom of the pit, things got even worse. They had no idea how Robin could have ended up in the river on a perfectly ordinary spring day, or even why she was supposed to be in this part of town. The autopsy was duly conducted, and to my shock, it turned out that Robin had taken a whole bunch of pills, probably sleeping pills, shortly before entering the water. The term suicide was discussed, but not directly for me at that stage. The police came to see me and asked me, maybe told me that when I was ready they would need to talk to me at the station. I didn't want to do that, not wanting to admit that Robin could have done such a thing, or that she would have had any reason to do it. God, I honestly hadn't yet come to terms with the fact that she wouldn't walk through the door at any minute with that seductive chuckle I'd so quickly fallen in love with. Shortly after seeing those police officers off, I opened my laptop for the first time since that horrible night to reluctantly check my email, and that's when I found it. I found the item that caused my life to spiral even further down the stream of life. A single piece of paper. The handwriting on it belonged to the Robin I knew so well, smudges smearing her words, so obviously her tears dripping onto the paper as she wrote them. My dear, beautiful husband, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I'm sorry, my love, that this breaks your heart, but I just can't go on. I can no longer put up with myself for what I have done to you in our marriage. 3 days ago, Tom asked me to stay in the office for 10 minutes after the others left to help him finish some paperwork, but that wasn't his real reason. I'm not sure if it qualified as rape, but he forced himself on me. I swear to you, John, that I tried to fight him off, but he was much stronger than me, and soon I was exhausted and just gave up. He undressed me and took me, and God help me, John, I gave in to him. The next thing I knew, he had me on the table. The only reason I know this is because after that he let me get dressed, but wouldn't let me leave until he showed me a video he had made of the whole thing, and made it clear that within the hour it would be edited to show the world how I had encouraged him and was a willing partner. That is, of course, unless I let him enjoy my body again. That night I went home and cried until I fell asleep. I swear I would have confessed to you that night, but you were gone for 4 days up north at that trade show, and by the time you got back, Tom was threatening to expose me to you, our friends, my parents, and the whole world. I couldn't think straight, and you weren't there to help me, so I gave in to his demands to have sex with him again to shut him up. Of course it was stupid of me, but by then it was too late, and he blackmailed me into continuing. I'm sorry, my love, but I can't take it anymore, and I have to end it. I won't be able to face you when you come back, and I won't be able to face the world, and I pray that you will forgive me for taking the easy way out. I hope you find the strength to forgive me for what I have done, and I pray that you forget me and find another woman who is more worthy. Your loving wife, Robin. There may be words to describe my feelings after reading this letter, but I can't string them together. I should have gone to the police right away, but the thought never crossed my mind. But if I had, my story would have been very different. I sat there remembering how we met. I had dropped out of school and joined the Merchant Navy instead of going to university, and soon found myself on a supertanker in the middle of the ocean. Royal Dutch Shell didn't believe in spending too much time training its new officer cadets before they could prove they could adapt to life at sea. You shouldn't spend money only to find out that I was seasick the whole time or missed my mom too much. It was a case of being thrown into the deep end and floating or drowning, and out there in the middle of the ocean, diving didn't seem like an appealing option. Over the next few years, our stops at ports around the world were shorter than the Royal Navy's, but our officers' uniforms seemed just as attractive to the local ladies, and our higher pay probably even more so. Not that I went with professional ladies, although the distinction between them and some of my bedmates was sometimes somewhat blurred. The first woman on my first shore leave might well have been an exception, though I would have been too drunk to notice the difference. If so, I wasn't the one who paid her, but it's no secret to shipmates that rookies don't come home still virgins. That pretty much summed up my personal life, until one day the company decided I had a special skill that they decided to use ashore in the company's technical office, and I started a new career direction by promising that I could go back to the ships if it didn't suit me. I decided that was fine with me on my 3rd week back ashore, when I was introduced to Robin at a party. She was unlike any girl I'd ever met before, and I barely knew how to act around her. Up until then, I had almost never dated a girl without ending up in bed with her the first night. Not unless I got too drunk or got into a fight before we got there. And yes, when you were young and stupid, even officers got into fights. In uniform, we were the epitome of quiet authority, but in plain clothes, we were as crazy as any other young guy. And the 3 years I spent in high school as an amateur boxer came in handy. Not that I was really good at it, but a little training goes a long way. But Robin was different from the other girls I'd been with, and I swear she was the one who gave the first hint that maybe after 4 weeks we should move on with our relationship, as she put it. So we moved on, and a year later we bonded in marriage. Another 6 years passed, and the knot was suddenly and violently severed, and as I wiped away my tears, I decided that someone would pay, and there was only one person who could pay to take my Robin away from me. I should have gone to the police, but, as I said, I didn't, but found myself opening the door to the damn insurance agency with almost no memory of how I got there. Brushing aside the receptionist's questions, I burst through the door into the office of Tom, the goddamn blower, and came face to face with him. "You bastard!" I shouted at him. "Mr. Fielding!" he breathed back, jumping to his feet and holding the table between us. "We're all so sorry to hear about your wife. Forgive?" I asked angrily. "You killed her. Now listen, Mr. Fielding, I think—" "It doesn't matter what you think. I interrupted him. You blackmailed her, you bastard. Bullshit, he shouted back at me. I have proof. You can't prove anything. He glared at me fiercely, eliminating if there was any doubt at all that Robin's letter was true. Then wait until the police read this, I shouted at him, holding Robin's letter in front of his face for him to read. Stupid bitch, he snapped, only managing to read the first few lines, and at that moment, something inside me snapped. Tom was bigger and heavier than me, but not by much, and unlike him, I'd learned to fight in the roughest ports in the world, and he probably hadn't swung a fist in anger since he'd graduated high school. I chased him around the table, Tom trying to keep it between us until he decided he saw a chance to surprise me. The punch was so long I could have easily dodged it, but I didn't even bother. His punch came on target, but before he could prepare another, I hit him 4 or 5 times, knocking him to the floor. In my haste to inflict further punishment, I angrily pushed the table to get to him, but only managed to tip him over on it. The bastard rushed after it, trying to defend himself from the barrage of punches and kicks I unleashed on him, screaming in frustration that I couldn't get to his face to hit him in the back of the head with my teeth. Maybe it was the noise. Maybe it was the way I angrily squeezed past the receptionist. And maybe there was a patrol car nearby. But the next thing I knew, the guys in blue were dragging me from the bloody mess below me, obviously tormenting me as I lashed out at them in a rage as well. I woke up in prison with pain throughout my body, surprised at my own cruelty but not regretting it. I hoped I had killed him, whatever the consequences, and swore I would one day when I discovered I hadn't. For the first time in my life, I discovered what it meant to truly hate someone. It wasn't a pleasant experience, but maybe in some strange way it eased my pain of losing my wife. I suppose the brain only has a certain capacity for emotion, and the sadness that so overwhelmed me had to make room for the hatred I had at the time. Tom had been pretty badly beaten up in the hospital, and I knew I would probably have to pay for it, but with the evidence I had of his blackmail, he would suffer even more at the hands of the court. This thought allowed me to calm down a little, until another suddenly came upon me like a speeding train. My evidence. Where was it? In my haste to go and smash his face in, it hadn't occurred to me to make a copy of Robin's letter, and when the police dragged me out of Tom's office, what had happened to him then? Oh, shit. I convinced myself that justice would prevail, and that the letter would turn up, but it just didn't happen. The state Tom was in then was doubtful he could dispose of it, and the secretary administrator denied seeing it when he was questioned by the police. I begged and cried, trying to persuade the law to look into the matter, but alas, to no avail. It came down to my word against his word that the letter existed at all, and in the mood I was in, my sanity must have been under some suspicion. I'm pretty sure the investigator believed my story deep down, but without proof, even I had to admit in the end that the case was a dead end. Not in my case. I beat Tom thoroughly, and when asked if he wanted to press charges, he went for it. Not content with being responsible for my wife's death, he now wanted revenge on me. Not only that, his lawyer opposed my bail while I was awaiting trial, telling the court that his client feared for his safety if I was released. Of course, he was acquitted, though he should have been worried about his life rather than his safety, and when I was denied bail, my hatred almost went into overdrive. The court case could have gone worse, all things considered, and I think I smiled for the first time in months when Tom, limping, walked over to give his testimony, the marks I'd made on him still evident. He avoided looking at me throughout his questioning, while my intense gaze in his direction never wavered once, and I wondered if that had an effect on some of the jurors. The prosecution bought into the fact that I did a little boxing and made it sound like I was a professional or something and that I was a dangerous person out of control. My attorney pointed out that it was at a low level when I was in high school and had nothing to do with the case. My thoughts were that if my boxing was a problem, they should have been concerned that I was also playing soccer, because I certainly did more damage to him by kicking him than I did with my fists, since he was hiding under that table. Another thing that went in my favor was when my attorney asked Tom if he thought I was right to attack him after blackmailing my wife and driving her to suicide. "Objection!" shouted the accuser. And the good judge, unfortunately, quite correctly allowed it, telling my attorney to be careful what he said and instructing the jury to ignore the question. "Okay," my attorney continued, looking at Tom. "Considering that my client thought that you were blackmailing his wife, then you think he was—" That's all he had time to do before there was another scream. "Objection, Your Honor! Noise!" It took a good 10 minutes to restore silence to the court, with another instruction to the jury to ignore what my attorney was saying and a rather firm reprimand to him. The prosecutor asked for a recess, but the judge refused, which also caused him difficulty, a mild hint that he believed the blackmail charge, though he couldn't let it be heard in the courtroom. When it was my turn to testify, it started all over again. When I was asked why I beat up my late wife's employer, and yes, my lawyer phrased it that way, it gave me a chance to make my point, but choosing my words carefully. After my wife committed suicide, I began, hesitating and looking directly at the jury to make sure they understood. I found a letter from her telling me why she did it. The prosecutor jumped to his feet, but was besieged by the judge, who waved him to sit down, warning me to be careful what I said, and asked where the letter was now. "I left it in the bastard's office when I went to beat him up for what he did to my wife," I replied, the judge waving at the guy on the other side as he jumped to his feet again. "Mr. Fielding," he reprimanded me sternly, "I warned you to be careful what you say in this room. How can I answer a question honestly if I'm not allowed to talk about this bastard who raped my wife and then blackmailed her and forced her to commit suicide?" I managed to speak before the court erupted again. There were shouts of "objections" and "order in court," and this time everyone seemed to jump to their feet. Even a couple of jurors stood up and shouted to add to the confusion. This time my attorney asked for a recess, and I think the judge was relieved to grant it, ordering the two attorneys to report to his chambers immediately. I was never privy to what was discussed between the three of them, but before the case resumed later that day, a brief message warned me that, although the charge was undoubted, I had my chance and should keep my mouth shut and it would do me good. Of course, I was not called to the stand, and it was all over pretty quickly. The judge made it clear to the jury that whatever excuse I had or may not have had, that my admitted assault in the office was a felony. They went out to think about it, and came back in a flash with a guilty verdict, but a recommendation for leniency. The judge duly gave me 3 months, which disappointed me until he pointed out that I was now a free man, having already spent that time in jail on remand. The newspapers and local news channels picked up on this, and I put my head down, having been warned that any inappropriate remarks I made could end up back in front of the judge. However, hints abounded, and although it didn't last long as news interest, Blower's reputation was ruined and his business collapsed within 6 months. I was very pleased with the way things turned out, and decided that Tom wasn't worth the risk of murder. I only spent 3 months in prison, but that was enough to realize that I didn't want to go back there. I forgave Robin, effectively deciding that I had nothing to forgive, except perhaps that she had acted unwisely and left me alone in the world. I knew I would never forgive Blowers, but I made the decision that I wasn't going to do anything about it. The end. No way. A year went by, and I was relieved that my company accepted me back, although I never felt completely comfortable in the office again. I kept an eye on what Blowers was doing, which didn't seem to be much during that first year. I don't know where he got the money from, but at the end of that year, he opened another office in a town about 40 miles away. It wasn't that big of a deal, and the office itself wasn't that well furnished, but I hadn't forgotten what he did, and it was too good for the likes of him. I caught him leaving the office one dark winter evening, and he may have guessed who it was, but he had no real way of confirming it. It might have been considered a fair fight the first time, But this time it wasn't. I didn't drag out the punishment, as I had a timeline to get back to where I was still officially, and the iron bar I took to the party allowed me to do so. I could have killed him, but I didn't want to anymore. I could have beaten him to a pulp, but I didn't want to. I wanted him to be hurt, but not so badly that he wouldn't recover months later, knowing, though he couldn't prove it, that it was me and that I'd be back again. And again. The police paid me a visit, of course, but I had an iron alibi, for I had never left the ship, that I had spent the evening visiting my old friends, and you can't be more reliable than a ship, can you? I was no longer sure I really liked the man I had become, but I was on a mission, and that's all that seemed to matter. I couldn't get over dating, but for the first time in my life, I paid a few women to scratch an itch that needed to be dealt with, but always felt somehow unsatisfied, wanting the women to get out as soon as possible afterward. My life seemed to stop, and I had no idea how long it would last. I knew I needed to change my life, so I decided to go back to sea, which, by then, most of the other people in my office were breathing a sigh of relief about. Another thing I didn't need to tell the psychologist was that I had to get rid of my obsession with making blowers pay. It was ruining my life, and I had to get over it. I hated the bastard, but that hatred was ruining my life more than his. Stupid, huh? Easy. Back to sea and all would have been well, but of course it didn't work out that way, did it? It was a few days before I was due to go to Kuwait for the 4th time this year when it happened. Purely by accident. As I was walking down the street, I practically bumped into him. You bastard, he growled, standing there just 3 feet between us. Get lost, I threw back at him, backing away as he moved at me. You'll pay Fielding, he threatened, and suddenly all my good intentions vanished like magic. I had him. I had him where I wanted him, and he had no idea. I had him, and I was going to use that to my advantage. He swung at me, and I ducked somewhat clumsily, looking around to make sure there were plenty of witnesses around us to confirm what was happening, that he was the one making the unprovoked attack on me. He aimed another poorly aimed punch at me, and this time I let his fist graze my chin, exaggerating the effect, recoiling back, my boxing days, however limited, coming back to me. He jumped at me again, another punch catching me somewhat off guard and snapping my head back. Damn, that hurt. Almost automatically, I hit him with my left straight to the face, feeling something break under my fist, and then my right aimed at his unprotected chin as he jerked back. I missed. I aimed too low and missed his chin by a good few inches. I missed his chin and crashed right into his throat, feeling his caddy get crushed by the force of my blow. He collapsed. I moved to kick the shit out of him, but he collapsed in front of me, grabbing his throat and coughing horribly. I prepared to kick him where it would hurt the most, but I stopped, took a deep breath, and backed away from him. He wasn't worth it, not when there were so many witnesses around to tell what had happened. Now it was my turn. An hour later, I was at the local police station filing a complaint with the names and addresses of the 5 people who had witnessed his unprovoked attack on me. He was going down. This time it was bloody blowers on the dock and me on the witness stand. It was a lower court with only a judge, not a jury, mainly because neither of us had gone to the hospital. I was kind of hoping for a life sentence with hard labor, chained in the dungeon of the Tower of London, but had to settle for a 3-month suspended sentence. Frankly, it's not that surprising. It may not seem like much, but it somehow assuaged my anger. And even if it didn't make my hatred disappear completely, my urgent need for revenge at least receded. I began to tell myself that even though he had forced my wife to kill herself, he hadn't meant for it to end that way. I even started blaming myself for not being around that night when she came home, and so I wasn't there to confess. The one thing I didn't think about was that nothing was Robin's fault. Her memory was untouchable. I wasn't doing this for her. I was doing it for me. I knew that my hatred was consuming me, and that if I was going to continue to live my life and get out of the bottomless pit I was falling into, I had to do something. In desperation, I even went so far as to go to a psychologist. Not one of your expensive, highly trained psychoanalysts in a fancy office, but just some fairly ordinary guy with a lot of life experience, a good listener, with some simple, sensible, and sometimes bloody obvious advice. The main piece of advice he gave me was that I couldn't just hide my grief and hatred, but I had to confront it. To confront it, I would have to forgive blowers. If I couldn't, I would continue to be a very unhappy person, and my life would not be worth living. Until I got rid of my hatred, I would not be able to go through a period of grieving as I should. He suggested, and I agreed, that in order for this to work, my forgiveness must be known to blowers, and the best way to do that is to face him and forgive him. I know it's not easy, but this counselor guy was pretty convincing, and it was probably the only way forward, however unpleasant it might be. So that's what I did, and it worked perfectly. 100%, you might say. The thing is, however, it didn't quite work out the way the counselor had envisioned. It took me 3 days to track him down. His second agency failed. His license was revoked now that he had a criminal record. I found him working in an office for some car insurance specialist, filling out claim forms or something like that. He didn't want to meet me, of course, but I convinced him otherwise, and eventually I managed to meet him on neutral ground in a local park. We sat on either side of a secluded park bench, glancing nervously at each other, both wanting to get this meeting over with as soon as possible. "So what was this meeting, Fielding?" he demanded. "I forgive you," I blurted out, almost choking on my words, but desperate to say my word and disappear. "What?" he snorted in surprise. "I forgive you," I repeated, the words even harder to say a second time. "I know what you did to my wife, but I forgive you." "Why?" "Because I needed to move on," I told him, though even as I said those words, I suddenly realized that it wasn't going to be the magical solution I was looking for. It just wouldn't work. "But I made her," he smirked at me. "I bloody raped her that first time." "I know," I forced myself to say, gripping onto the armrests of the bench to keep from lashing out at him. "Damn you, Fielding," he laughed loudly. "She wasn't even a good partner." Later, much later, I convinced myself that it was all his fault and that he really had said the wrong thing at the wrong time. His words made me blush, and the original purpose of the encounter was forgotten. I had a couple of cuts on my face afterward, so he must have made some effort to fight back, and I have vague memories of him begging for mercy. I can remember the pleasant feeling when my fist smashed something on his face for the second time since our conflict began, and his screams when I kicked the bastard a few times. I can't remember anything else, not even walking away and leaving him there. I was in a kind of daze until that evening, when I walked up the gangway to my ship leaving for Saudi Arabia. If I thought about it, I'd be surprised that I made it to the ship at all without being captured by the police. But I did. Not only that, but I was never interviewed or even contacted about the murder of Tom Blowers. Yeah, that's right, you heard me right. Blowers wasn't a big guy, but his murder made headlines. Not because of him, but originally because of the man they arrested for his murder. His name was Mike Jones, and if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because he was a pretty well-known local hoodlum involved in all sorts of small and not-so-small scams and crimes in the neighborhood. What I didn't know, but what became clear, was that a certain Mrs. Jones worked for the insurance company in the same office as Blowers, and that he was up to his old tricks again, and Mr. Jones resented it. When I first heard the news on board ship that night that a body had been found in the park with a bullet wound to the head, I assumed that the press had just gotten it wrong again. When it became clear that they hadn't, I was shocked, to say the least. The court case became a sensation. Jones never denied shooting Blowers, and made it very clear why the bastard deserved it. But the case was thrown into disarray when the medical examiner stated that Blowers may have already been dead when Jones shot him, only to be disagreed with by another equally distinguished gentleman of medical persuasion who objected that such a claim could not be substantiated. Jones, for his part, realizing that he could hardly be found guilty of killing a man who was already dead, concocted a plausible story that he had gone in search of blowers and followed him into the park. When he found him lying senseless in a pool of blood by a park bench, he put a bullet in his brain in anger anyway. He also mentioned the other man he saw hurrying away from the scene, to my surprise, describing him as a swarthy, foreign-looking weirdo about 5 feet 6 inches tall and limping. Since I am just over 6 feet tall, with fair, almost reddish skin and had no mobility issues, his statements were certainly cause for speculation. Whether he made up a story about dating someone, or whether it was just his way of thanking me for doing his job for him by giving a false description, I'll never know now, but I'm sure I was grateful. It certainly clouded the proceedings, and the press spent the day speculating about who the mysterious other man was. Reports of the appearance of the mysterious other man, as he came to be called, came from all over the country, and sparked a debate about whether it was wise to allow so many immigrants to settle here. Meanwhile, Jones's charge was reduced from murder to manslaughter, and when that too began to look dubious, it seemed that the defense had accepted the offer to find him guilty of aggravated assault and possession of an unauthorized weapon. He still got a 9-month sentence, but could have been out in 5 if he had behaved himself. Unfortunately for him, he didn't, but that's another story that has nothing to do with me. So I didn't know if I'd killed blowers or not, and that was fine with me. I kind of kept my promise to myself that one day I would kill the creep without feeling like I had become a murderer. My beautiful Robin had been avenged and my hatred had no purpose left, and so, almost accidentally, disappeared. Just as the counselor predicted, going to tell him of my forgiveness. Everything worked out perfectly, just not the way he predicted. And me? Well, I've been on ships for a few years and even got my assistant captain's certificate. I wouldn't say I had a girl in every port in those years, but I had a small but select list of phone numbers of young ladies who were usually very happy to see me. Eventually, my services were again in demand ashore, and by the time I retired, I found myself assistant director of operations, which pleased my wife to no end. That's right. I found myself another special woman to whom I could give my love, and we had plenty of time to produce 2 beautiful children. They became the center of my universe, but even so, every now and then, my thoughts would return to Robin and how things could have turned out differently if her life hadn't been wasted so early. I couldn't help it, but I couldn't deny that sometimes, just sometimes, in the privacy of my own mind, even though I loved my new family, I still missed Robin terribly, and somewhere in the back of my mind, always would.